Welcome to The Startup Leap, the #1 podcast interviewing startup founders who have taken the leap into starting their own businesses.
Here on The Startup Leap, we hear real, raw, and relatable stories of these entrepreneurs, how they've navigated taking the leap, and the decisions they've made. We're your hosts.
I'm Yvonne.
And I'm Maria.
And this is the Startup Leap podcast.
Yvonne and Maria are partners at Local Globe and OpenSeed VC, respectively. Local Globe and OpenSeed are independent of the Startup Leap podcast. Any statements made by Maria, Yvonne, or the Startup Leap guests are solely their view and are not advice. Endorsements by the Startup Leap, its guests, Maria and Yvonne.
Thank you so much, Julia, for joining this conversation today. We're so excited to have you. I guess very quickly, for the benefit of our listeners, 1 minute, who is Julia? If people don't know you, and I'm sure many people know you, but from your words, who is Julia and how would you introduce yourself?
Oh my gosh, there's so many ways to describe yourself, especially, at the point in life that I am now, because I've had so many experiences as a woman. But, I am first and foremost the daughter of my parents, two incredible people who raised me with an abundance of love and support. And so a lot of what I've experienced in life has come because of this wonderful, supportive family. I'm also a mom myself. I have two little boys, Mosi, who's 6, and Olu, who's 2. My wonderful life partner, Tremaine. And so I am a woman who's a mom and running a family. I think the thing that I most want to introduce about myself for this audience, though, is my work as a builder. I've always been someone who is deeply interested in bringing things into the world that haven't existed before. So at my core, I'm a builder, I'm a doer, I'm a maker. And sometimes we don't assign this title of being a creative to people who are in the world of business, but I actually do identify myself as a creative person. And my mode of creation really is creating companies.
I love that. And we saw that come through your background. It's so incredible what you've built so far. I'm curious, from a childhood perspective, were there any core memories or pivotal points that you started seeing those early signs of wanting to create and, build a solution that doesn't exist?
Definitely. Like, if you ask my parents, there was never a point in time where I didn't have a business. Like,
Really?
oh my gosh. When I was a little girl, I used to walk around my neighborhood and pick other people's flowers, bundle them together to my house, the little ribbons that I would get from my mom's sewing basket, and then go back to those same houses and resell them as bouquets.
I love it.
I love that.
But it was
I guess
brilliant.
you could call that
Like,
early processing. Like,
what a smart inventory strategy. After that, I had a babysitting business, but I didn't just do babysitting. I did homework coaching and meal prep. And so instead of charging, like, I don't know, $10 an hour like the other babysitters, I charged $18 an hour. I charged a premium. I had a car washing business. I shined shoes in my neighborhood. I've always been interested, not just in creating things and letting them kind of sit somewhere. I like the process of building a product. I like the process of creating transactions. It's actually like thrilling to me to create something that people value.
Gives you energy.
It does, to create something that other people value so much that there's an exchange there. And so money has also always been part of the equation. And I think one really good thing that my parents did, it was really actually my grandpa did growing up, was he taught me what money was. And he made me feel comfortable understanding about money and talking about money. And I think a lot of times we don't do that with young people, especially our young girls.
Yeah.
It's sort of like money is a dirty word. You should think about being the best, being a good person, doing a good job, but don't talk about money. We don't talk about money. And actually in my family, that wasn't the case. And I think that's been a pretty important part of my confidence as an entrepreneur, is being confident with the money piece of the transaction, not just the building of the product.
I love that. I think one question that we had just listening to your story and reading on your story was more around you growing up in the Bay Area. We have familial influences in how we think about entrepreneurship, where we live, our families and maybe entrepreneurs around us, but also where we stay. I'd love to get a sense from you, whatever years ago, what was the entrepreneurial atmosphere beyond your initial family like? Did that influence how you thought about, what good looked like in terms of your ambition? It'd be lovely to explore that a little bit as well.
Certainly, certainly. You know, where I'm from is more than just the Bay Area. Where I'm from is really includes where my ancestors are from, right? And my so you think about my grandparents; they were born in South Carolina and West Virginia. They were born in the Deep South, and they actually moved to the Bay Area during the Great Migration, which is when millions and millions of Black people moved from the South to the North or northern cities, mostly to take advantage of economic opportunities. But these cities were totally segregated. And so if you were Black and you wanted to go to a dentist or a doctor, those services didn't exist. So my grandparents were dentists. They moved to the Bay Area to start a dental practice. So I really grew up in an entrepreneurial family. And of course, if you're the Black dentist, you're going to be close with the restaurant person and you're going to be close with the banker and the lawyer. So this whole, kind of cadre of people who I grew up with and who participated in raising me were almost all entrepreneurs. So I really thought it was just like the normal thing that at some point you grow up, you get educated, and then you build your business. I had much less of a perspective on you grow up, you get educated, and then you go work at a big corporation. So it was really incredibly entrepreneurial because I really grew up in a family that was part of the foundation of building small businesses in San Francisco, particularly within the Black community, the Latina community, and the Asian community, which were communities that had been systematically left out of conversations around ownership and wealth building. So it really seemed normal to me. So that's one side. Then there's the other side, which is San Francisco always has been and still is, no matter what the haters say, to me, honestly, like the center of tech innovation. Since the early days of Silicon Valley and the semiconductor industry, you'd be hard pressed to point to a game changing, world changing tech innovation that doesn't either have its roots right here or that isn't related. And I'm unapologetically proud of San Francisco for that reason. So I do think there's this other element that I was, kind of after college was living and working in New York City. What's better than that? Um, but there was a part of me in my gut, in my soul, that knew that if I was going to do something really big in tech, that I should go back home, that I should go back to San Francisco to do it, or at least to have a connection there. Yeah.
I love that. It's almost as if entrepreneurship is very much in your DNA. So you mentioned New York. You made the move over to New York and you started Mexicue. I'd love to hear a bit about how you ideated around that, the very early stages, why you decided to do that. I mean, it sounds as if you already knew that you would be an entrepreneur, but what was it that led to you starting that?
And I'd add as well, you had started it with friends. There's a nuance around that. It'd be lovely to explore how that kind of all happened with your friends in terms of the ideating, how it went from an idea to actually something real and tangible.
Yeah. Well, when I graduated from business school, although I, had considered entrepreneurship, I didn't go straight into entrepreneurship. I actually went straight into working for a fantastic restaurant group. But as soon as I got there, I realized, oh my gosh, it's going to take me a decade to get to the point where I'm a leader of this organization. There was so much talent, so much competition. And I was working, with folks who had been in this space of restaurants for far longer than I had. So I was moving into an industry where I was not a domain expert. And I knew it was just going to take so long, or I felt that it was going to take so long to get to the point where I was calling the shots, And so I thought to myself, I can stay and slug it out and grow. And maybe in 10 years, have the VP title or have the top job in 15 or 20. Maybe I'm an owner in 20 or 25. But gosh, that seemed like a long time, especially in my early 20s, right? And so I just sort of thought, well, what if there was a different path? What if I could be in this industry, but just take the leap? And so I was introduced to two guys, Tom and Dave. They were actually the best friends that had the concept for Mexicue. It was them that took the first leap, that created the brand, that got it out there. But where I came in very early was to operationalize that vision. And so, one path or like stair step into entrepreneurship can often be to be the first employee of a founding team. And there were elements of that business or business lines that I built from
Mhm.
scratch, right, that I founded. But that is often, I think, a really elegant way to move into entrepreneurship is if can you find a founder or a founding team who you really, really believe in, whose vision aligns with your own, and really come in and be the operation person, be the finance person, be the marketing person, like fulfill, actually, maybe you're going to be all those people at once. And that can be a way to kind of dip your toe in the water first, get exposure to what it's like to really be part of a founding team without kind of having to be the first person in.
And I guess when you're joining a founding team, it's a very small team. How did you decide and rationalize, that was a team that you wanted to work with, right? Because at the end of the day, it's about people as well when you're joining a company so early.
It was so much about people, Yvonne. It was so much about people. Of course, it was the right industry, right? I didn't go and work in oil and gas. Like I wanted to work in food and specifically in New York City. So that box was checked. More specifically, I was very excited about the fast casual segment of the restaurant industry, which I'd spent a little bit of time learning about Shake Shack and was really inspired by Chipotle, and I was just fascinated that there was kind of this new category of restaurants that felt recession proof, where there was a lot of opportunity to create value and grow. So there was some kind of initial alignment around the market and the market segment and the location, right? Those boxes had to check. But other than that, um, the primary thing that I was doing was evaluating the team. Do I enjoy working with these people? Because we're going to work really, really hard together. Um, do I know other people who have worked with them? And what did they say? Um, how are they going to react when things get tough? How are we going to organize ourselves? Do we have complementary skill sets? And so we actually like founder dated each other for a while before we decided to work together more formally. I think I, initially created like a consulting agreement, as we do,
Yeah.
right? Um, and thought, and let's see how this goes. And I think you learn a lot about what it's like to work with someone when you give yourself a space to try it out first. So I didn't have to jump in 2 feet, full stop. I kind of, de-risk the proposition of becoming an entrepreneur by taking steps toward there. And I'm really thankful and glad that I did. Mexicue now, my buddy Thomas is still running Mexicue. That business is almost 12 years old, which, in the world of entrepreneurship is rare, let alone for restaurants. The business has survived pandemics, the
Mhm.
business is growing and creating a lot of joy. So I feel so glad that I had that opportunity. And that really was the launch pad for me to develop the confidence and the chops to begin businesses from scratch all on my own.
I love
I
that.
love it.
And I guess
I would.
and I guess just in hindsight, what were some of the key learnings? I mean, looking back 12 years now, what were some of the key learnings that I guess enabled you to go forward and build further businesses?
Well, I mean, this is maybe a controversial statement, but I think the biggest thing that it taught me is that most people should not s- start their own businesses.
Hmm.
It is a crazy thing to do.
Mm.
We went long stretches without paying ourselves and imagined being a single girl in New York City with no paycheck. We went long stretches without having health insurance. In fact, I remember coming home for Thanksgiving one time and casually letting it slip to my dad that I had no health insurance, and he was so disappointed.
It's like know what you're getting into because it's not going to be fun. It's not a jolly ride.
It's not a jolly ride. It's a great ride, but it's not a jolly ride. You have days where you work so hard that your like body is cramping. You miss weddings, you miss baby showers, you miss trips with your friends. It's hard to really invest in romantic relationships a lot of times
Mhm.
when you're in the early stages of startups. You're going to experience the highest highs and the lowest lows. And you hear all of these things, but once you've experienced it, I think it's really telling. So for me, of course, I learned about capital efficiency and go to market and, all of these like optimizing operations and raising. There were definitely skills that I developed, in those early passes on entrepreneurship. But the biggest thing that I learned was what it was going to take emotionally,
Mm.
psychologically, spiritually, and even
Yeah.
physically to be able to call myself a founder and an entrepreneur for the longer haul. And I
I
think
love that.
is the most important thing that people have to understand is you have to expect obstacles. It is neither going to be easy nor pleasant for most of the time. And if you still think that sounds like fun, great tips and tricks for how to do it.
I like to say it's like chewing glass, but like still going ahead with it. It's like it's not the most fun thing, but there are highs where you're like, I imagine this thing and it exists, and you're like seeing how it impacts other people, and that can be so rewarding. But you're absolutely right. It is not a jolly ride. It is hard. And I love that you spotlight that. I would love to segue into Zoom, but before that, one of the things that I often think about is how you have to be authentic as an entrepreneur. And in your journey, I actually quite love that. You've anchored through the varying experiences that you've had and found expression in many different places. When you transitioned to Zoom Pizza, you had a stint with a jazz club. I think it was kind of like bringing it back to like, I would love to talk about your logic around that. And then also, how you've navigated making sure you stay authentic in a space, and the space being entrepreneurship, food technology, and you just being a builder, but not necessarily fitting the mold of what a
Mm,
traditional builder in this world potentially like looks like. So I'd love
mm,
to hear how you navigate that, because I find that personally quite inspiring.
mm. I appreciate that. So, yeah, I mean, how does like building a cracker company relate to running a jazz club or relate to making pizza with robots or relate to tackling climate change with artificial intelligence? Like they all sound like wildly different contexts and opportunities. But for me, there's always a through line. And the through line for me is like, how might we use the power of food to save the world? And that sounds really lofty, but that's actually the point.
Mm,
That is my North Star. Like that is what I'm always thinking about, no matter what it looks like I'm doing on the surface, no matter what the medium is, or the market, or the stage, or the
mm.
location. I'm always pointing my heart and my mind toward that same question. How might we use the power of food to help save our world?
And
And
why food? I'm curious.
oh, I just have always been so much more alive and connected and happy when I'm enjoying food with people. Like, I'm the kind of person who reads cookbooks on my beach vacation. I go to the grocery store sometimes, even when I'm not shopping, just because I'm fascinated by what
Wow.
people buy and why. I'm like the first person at the farmers market on Sundays, and everybody knows my name. I've always loved being in the place where food is happening. It is not just like an intellectual interest for me, it is a passion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last night, I had joy of going to an event with Christopher John Rogers, who, if you don't know him, follow him immediately. I think he's the most important designer of our time. And he said something in his talk about entrepreneurship that really struck me. He said, pay attention to your little quirks, the things
Mm.
you're just obsessed with that maybe you trivialize. What is it that you're searching for? What is it that you're always thinking about? What is it that you're tinkering with on the side? And for me, it's always, always, always food. And sometimes we think of these things as like, oh, that might just be a hobby, or that's just my little, nerdy little quirky thing I'm interested in. It's not. It's actually probably a sign that you have a superpower in a given area. And for me, it's just always been food.
I
Yeah,
love
I
it.
think
I
that's
love it.
so important. As an investor, we often look for that obsession, and it sounds like you have that obsession with food because it's not an easy journey, as you alluded to, right? And so, without that obsession, that real passion for it, then when times get tough, what's really that guiding star? So, I absolutely love that.
So
Absolutely.
Zoom Pizza, how did that come about? Co-founding a business again. And I would love to talk through the steps from idea to reality. Was it easier doing it a second time? Did you find the same, mental models that you had to rely on the second? And maybe in retrospect, taking that leap again, what were you most worried about in terms of the risk? And in retrospect, did that come to pass? Like, did it materialize with the power of retrospect now? I'd love to navigate that.
Yeah. So in between Mexicue and Zoom, there was a startup that happened that never went anywhere that I don't even know if I've ever talked to anyone else. I had
Mm,
met a friend in New York City, and we both had this fantastic idea, we thought, which was to create a wish listing app. So
mm.
anything that you could see on the internet, you would tag and put onto a wish list and share. Sound familiar? No idea that Pinterest was actually being built.
Exactly. I was like, that is literally Pinterest because I have all my wish list on Pinterest.
And the thing about it was, I was not an engineer, nor was the other person who I was co founding the business with. We didn't have capital behind us. We were working at our full time jobs. And so, to me, that was an example of what Michael Siebel from Y Combinator will say is the idea doesn't really matter, is not
Yeah.
enough. We had a great idea. Obviously, it was a great idea. Look how incredible Pinterest is. If the world needed that. But our ability to execute against the idea, our ability to gather resources against the idea, that is what makes the difference. So that learning really informed how I approached Zoom. It was not just, of course, it's a good idea to think about ways to improve the efficiency and the safety of people who are making food. Of course, it's a good idea to bring fresher, healthier food into the urban core. Of course, it's a good idea to create packaging that doesn't destroy the planet and create waste. Of course, those are all great ideas. And those were the foundational ideas of of Zoom. But what I needed to make sure also existed was the resources and the team, right? And so that was initially what I was vetting when I went to take on that opportunity. And it was very clear from the very beginning. I remember going out with our first pitch deck for Zoom Pizza. This was back in 2015. And we raised like $2.5 million in 4 days.
Wow.
Wow. And I was like, okay, this actually,
There's something here.
there is something here. There is something here. And during that, I remember I had a full time job in New York City still when I was evaluating this opportunity. I took a week vacation, which I had, and those are the days when I never took vacation. And I was like, if in 7 days, I can de risk this, right? Can I prove that we can raise money for it? Can I prove that we can hire a team for it? I gave myself 7 days to assess that. And at the end of 7 days, it was so clear because not only did we have investor commitments, we also did our first initial interviews for potential CTOs and engineers 1, 2, and 3. And there was just so much talent and interest in what we were doing and in the place that I thought, okay, it's not only that we have a couple of great ideas that could be really big, but we can execute against these ideas. We can find the resources, we can find the team. And so that was the big decision point for me to move forward.
I really love the idea of, will smart people join me on this journey as a validation technique? In Richard, like as I think about it, it makes sense. But the way you kind of expressed it, one way to validate whether there's something there is if you have really smart people, if you have investors who are now thinking about investing just off the back of hearing your ambition and vision for the company. And also, I would say, to be honest, Julia, it might be a testament to your team's ability to pitch the solution in a way that was compelling and that painted the vision and the ambition that you had for Zoom at the time. So yeah, I'd love to, because you after Zoom you did Moonshot, and I'd love to understand the segue as well. And also because you're such an experienced entrepreneur, I'd love to get the nuance across how things got easier or harder
Mm.
in the leaps? Do you get to a point where it just becomes, second nature? You don't get worried or anxious or scared anymore when you start something new? Or is it that you just have rails and mental models that help you navigate that? So from the Zoom to Moonshot transition, I'd love to understand that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that happened for me between Zoom and Moonshot was that I became a mom. Um, and just to be really transparent, I am not someone who thought that I was going to have children. I um, just did not think that was in the cards for me. It wasn't something that I was really focused on. And so, to become a mom at 39, almost 40 years old, first of all, anybody who becomes a parent, it's a total change in your identity. Like there's few things that happen to you in life where your identity shifts so quickly and so permanently. But add on to that the fact that it wasn't something that I had carried as a belief and plan before that. And it was even more of a paradigm shift. And, it was I just became a different person. I don't know how to describe it. I'd always been interested in the relationship between food and our world, but there was something about just like holding my child, my baby Mosi, in my arms for the first time, where I just became like absolutely obsessed with doing everything that I could to safeguard the health of the planet for him, so just selfishly, really, as a mom. And so that like shift made me realize that the things that I was doing in food tech were interesting and at scale could create some benefit, but there was a more pressing problem around our food supply chains and around climate change specifically that had to be solved. And so it was really that. It was me changing as a person that changed what I wanted to do at work. And I think, as people, particularly as women, we live so many lives. My mom will say, you're a completely different person every 7 years.
Mm.
She's for 54 years. My parents have been married for 54 years. She'll say, it's a completely different marriage every 7 years. And so, although I've always been an entrepreneur, most of my career I have, although I've always been interested in food in our world, the shape and the form of the businesses that I've built have been informed also by where I am on my journey. Yeah. Um, have things gotten easier? I don't know that the work itself gets easier, but I think you do just or I have gotten better
Yeah.
at it. I still get nervous, when I'm pitching a big customer. I still have nights where I'm up figuring out how I'm going to get my fundraise done. I still get butterflies when I meet an amazing candidate and I really, really want to get them over the line. I still worry. Those things don't go away. But it's exactly what you said, Maria. I just have more frameworks to quickly get myself into the mindset that's needed to get the job done. Right. And so the time that I spend worrying or fretting or being scared has just become so small that it might be imperceptible to someone else.
Yeah.
So if you work on my team, you might experience me as somebody who doesn't worry, who's not afraid, somebody who, is always in the zone. And that might be what it looks like on the surface because I'm so many decades into this. But actually what's happening inside is that I have my tips and tricks to reset my energy, to reset my mind very quickly so that I can continue to stay in the flow that I need to be in order to be successful. That makes sense.
Yeah.
It does.
And I think that that's a very powerful point because as an entrepreneur, you're going into the deep and you don't know what's ahead of you, but you have to feel the fear and do it anyway, right?
That's right. That's exactly it. And the more times you do that, the better.
Yeah.
The more times you feel the fear and do it anyway, the better you get.
I'd love to talk about the fear of failure because that's what holds a lot of people back when they think about starting a business. And many people think like failure is like this end point. And I also don't like the word failure and the connotations we attach to it, because even if your business ends, is that a failure? Because sometimes it's nothing to do with you completely. Like it's life events. It's nothing to do with you. And you've had the experience of having really incredible startups, but also Zoom shut down. How did you navigate that? In retrospect, what are the things you probably tell yourself at the time as you were going through that, as the first time you'd gone through that? I imagine, at least building up to a point before deciding to shut it down. Yeah, I'd love to hear about
Yeah.
that as well.
I mean, in terms of Zoom, I left far before it shut down. I decided to step away from my own company,
How was
and
that?
really hard. And that at the time felt like a failure, you know,
Mm,
to, to it was the right decision to step away. I made that decision based on my own values, based on my own principles. But it was really hard. It was the hardest thing. It was my darkest time in my career, for sure. And it took me a little while to get back up. And I think the process of getting back up taught me a lot about resilience and how to overcome failure. So, at the point that Zoom eventually shut down, of course it was very sad to see. I had dear friends that were still there, but I had made my peace. You see, I had made my peace. I think failure is incredibly important. I'm Maria. I actually like to call it failure. I
mm,
think the energy of failure is very, very motivating.
mm,
And I think for me, it's a great thing to work not to fail. It doesn't mean that you don't fail in small ways all along the way and rebound and get up. But that dynamic, that push pull, I think is what creates the energy. I think the polarity between winning and losing is actually really powerful.
mm.
To be up against something, to motivate yourself to overcome something like that, that energy, you can move mountains and you can move teams like that. If everything is like, okay, it's okay if we win, it's okay if we lose, you lose that fighting spirit. And I think
Mm.
probably one thing that you'll notice, although founders come in so many different shapes and forms, one thing that many of us have is a chip on our shoulder. And that chip on your shoulder is so important. I look for it when I'm hiring salespeople at my company. I absolutely look for people who've got a chip on their shoulder, something that they need to overcome. Because I think when you have a healthy desire not to fail, you're less prone to kind of getting into the status quo mode. You're less prone to being entitled, which I think is one of the actually a death knell for any founder is a sense of entitlement, or a sense that people should. Um, so that's kind of how I think about failure. I
I
think
love
of failure
that.
as a friend, and a really, I have a really healthy relationship with it.
That's incredible reframing.
And I wanted to double click on that because I think building a team is one of the hardest things to do when you're building a company, right? And so, having now started various businesses, what are some of the key learnings, and what advice would you give to individuals when they're thinking about building their team?
Hmm. It's a really good question, and I've learned so much over the years about building and structuring teams. I could say that um, at this point in my career, I'm probably much better at hiring than I was earlier, you know? And what has changed for me is I am willing to take my time. There's a component of me as an operator that can be very process and timeline oriented. And the worst hires that I've made or the times, I shouldn't say, not they weren't bad. It wasn't the right,
A good fit, yeah.
have been when I was forcing myself because of a timeline or a resource gap, and I was like, oh, we just got to get someone in there. We just got to get someone in there. We just got to get before this raise or before this go to market. And those have always been the ones that didn't work out. So I tend to like to take my time. I had a business school professor say that you should be really slow to hire, and you have to be quick to fire. So the other piece of the talent equation is getting really good at identifying when someone needs to move on and making that decision decisively and swiftly and as kindly and generously as you can. There have been very few cases in my life as a founder and as a CEO where I've identified a talent gap and that person has ultimately overcome it. That's just never been the case. And I think particularly at startups where you don't have infinite resources
Or
to,
time.
or time, you have to be swift and decisive and kind and as generous as you can. And that every time that you have to let go of someone, I think it actually makes you better at hiring because the pain that you feel in having to let someone go, you remember that. And so the next time that you bring somebody into the organization, you're aware of that feeling that you had when you had to let someone go. And so I think those two things are related. Hiring and having to fire are absolutely related in my mind.
Absolutely. And I guess fast forwarding to Moonshot. So in terms of the business, obviously North Star is to make better food for the world. Just curious, obviously that was acquired by Patagonia. How was that experience? Having gone from building a company to it being acquired in very little time, actually. What were some of the thoughts that you had to go through in order for you to go through with that? And, did you have any reservations at the time? How did you get the team aligned? Curious to unpick that a bit.
Mm, really good question. So, Moonshot, even by its name, was out from the very, very start. Once in a while in your career, you build something, just takes, and of course we worked really, really hard. And of course our team, particularly the team who worked with me were incredibly talented. And so I'm not meaning to say that it was purely magic, but there was a bit of magic to Moonshot. It was the right product. It was crazy delicious. It was the right time. We were the right team. And we had this nonlinear growth. And we were growing much faster even than our own projections, which, when you're building your projections early on as a startup, you're shooting for the moon. And so Moonshot just kept exceeding our expectations. But it was growing very quickly and it needed a lot of resources. And at the same time that Moonshot was growing, PlanetFWD, our software company, was growing. And when we looked at the two businesses and what they would need to scale and grow, it was very clear that they had to grow separately. You know, CPG versus SaaS.
Software. Yeah. And
Yeah.
did you build was it a natural like start with them both? Or did you start with Moonshot, saw the opportunity for Planet Forward, and then started trying to separate them? Or did they both come naturally?
We always knew that we were building a platform business. Um, the nature of the platform changed over time. So we started first with this question: can we prove that customers want food that's better for the planet? Can we prove that we can design food that actually meets that promise? Can we prove that we can actually outperform the market based on our sustainable positioning? Right. So we were the first climate friendly, like a positioned as climate friendly offering. So we're really building a category as we were launching that product. But in order to do all of that, we needed a tremendous amount of data and solutions that also just didn't exist. And so we started to build these internal tools, which then became the customer facing tools at Planet Forward. So the two were very, very much related. But at the same time, they were fundamentally different businesses. And I think, you know, it has worked out beautifully for us, the Patagonia acquisition, the growth of Planet Forward. It is, I think, frankly, a really hard way to build a business, like to the extent possible. If you can focus on one and only one business model in the beginning and raise the right amount of capital with the right people for that, that's a really good way to go. Designing two incredibly different business models and then running them simultaneously was very, very hard. And again, like it is working out, but it isn't if you can avoid it.
Try to, okay. Especially being like a consumer products founder, like you built products and in the food tech space, and then now you're thinking of software as a service. It's kind of a different model selling to, I mean, you're in the industry, so definitely there was that edge. You understand the problem because you built the problem, the solution off the back of something you faced, and you're the ideal customer profile. But like building a software company is very different from building a products company. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you navigated the mental models as a founder, building both, because they're two different business models as well.
And just to
Yeah,
add
there's
to that,
certainly
some of the assumptions you would have made at the time and how they panned out in the end.
Yeah, I mean, the way to solve around or for any place where you're not strong as a founder is absolutely with your team. And none of what we built at Moonshot or are building at Planet Forward would be possible without some very important and critical key hires who are frankly far more talented than me in their respective areas. And them deciding, like you said before, when smart people want to come and work with you, you're onto something. When people who are smarter than you in a given area want to come and do it with you, that's a really big deal as well. So that's how I would think about kind of the level of information that was required for each company versus the other and how to address that and get up the curve. It was really, I addressed it through hiring and then certainly by bringing in the right investors. So making sure that you're not just thinking about, who's going to write a check, but what are they going to do after they write the check? How is this investor uniquely positioned to help my business grow? Who is in their network? And often, as you're getting to know investors, you can suss some of that out. One thing I really like seeing in an investor is where they're willing to make an introduction for you during the fundraising process, like a commercial introduction. I think that's a really good sign. Or investors who want to get to know you and demonstrate how they can be helpful to the business, even when you're not raising. So I think that's a really good sign too. In terms of like initial theses and how they panned out, we believed that consumers today wanted to buy food products that were aligned with their values, and that proved to be true. We believed that within our category, there was room for a new brand that was disruptive, that had unapologetically, climate friendly positioning, and that proved to be true. I think the thing that we probably I underestimated was just the sheer complexity of running two very different business models simultaneously. And although I had amazing teams, a kind of mental strain for me as the founder to move between those two,
Context switching between both, yeah.
yeah, was more challenging than I believed it would be.
Especially also as a solo founder for Planet Forward. And, with Moonshot, did you build Moonshot with other co-founders or was it just you?
I built it with an amazing team, but I'm the
Okay.
sole
Okay.
founder.
So founder. Okay. On both. Okay. All right. I thought it was around. Okay. I'll hand over to Yvonne. I think you had a question.
No, and just curious because I know that one of the things you have done with Planet Forward is some M&A, and oftentimes when we think about M&A, it's from the perspective of companies being acquired, as Patagonia acquired Moonshot. So just curious how you decided to go about inorganic growth. It's something that I don't think a lot of founders see as an option in the early days.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, the situation with Moonshot and Planet Forward were really unique because we had two, sets of assets that were under one parent company, and they had very different capital needs and potential exit multiples and the types of talent that would be needed. And so it made a lot of sense to spin one off. And then we had two options. Do you spin it off and raise another round, or do you spin it off and find an acquirer? And given the values alignment with Patagonia, and the fact that we were really had a similar point of view on value, it just made quite a lot of sense for the business to be acquired. But I shouldn't say it was an asset sale, right? So it was a collection of assets living under a parent company. So we still hold our equity in Planet Forward, which was the starting point. So that's like a bit of a nuance there. Over the course of building Planet Forward, we actually did an acquisition. We acquired another company, and so that was just one of those cases where you have to test: do we build, do we buy, or do we partner? And given the incredible data moat that we wanted to be able to achieve in our space, we knew that we needed to quickly amass a tremendous amount of data. And to build that data on a first party basis would take too long. To partner for that data would mean that we didn't have it wouldn't be our IP. And then making the acquisition, again, it was the right time, it was the right valuation. I think for founders that are considering M&A as part of their growth strategy, one of the most important things that you can do so that you don't waste a lot of time is to align with the other party early on what the price is going to be and just have that honest conversation. if you're off by, 20%, 50% even, you can probably get there. But if you're off by an order of magnitude, it's
Yeah.
best just not to waste your time. And so in both cases, kind of that early alignment around the exchange of value was a really critical way to de-risk the time that you're going to spend, because M&A, of course, like anything that you do, is incredibly time consuming and there's a lot of risk involved. You're going to need to spend time, you're going to need to do diligence, your lawyers are going to be very busy, you're going to pay your lawyers a lot. And so you only want to do that if you know from the very beginning that there's a there there.
And just curious, just want to go into that a bit more. So, what were some of the key things you had to think through? And post acquisition, just curious how you managed the integration. And, you know, I'm guessing that this is something that was all very new to you. So, just keen to understand how you managed that and navigated it with the team.
Yeah, I mean, you can study engineering at Harvard and you can study business at Stanford Business School. And of course, everything that you do as a founder is still going to be a bit new. I mean, many things that you're doing for the first time. So I tend not to think of that as a risk factor. That's why you have teams and advisors and investors and lawyers. Um, but at the end of the day, I think making sure that you are aligned, from a values perspective with the other party is really important. And that's going to inform, kind of the quality of the energy during the transaction, making it feel like you're both on the same side of the table. And it also is going to certainly inform what happens post acquisition during the integration, right? Because you can always point back to, we have similar values around X. That is why we decided to work together. And so it has to be more than just a transaction. It has to be kind of a meeting of the hearts and minds, I think, for it to work in the longer term.
I really love that. I think we should segue a little bit into just conclusions, just to try to get your insights at the tail end. One of the questions I had was just around values alignment. It's very clear that you're insistent on that. Where does that come from? Um, I would love to explore how you're able to stay firm in what you want and what you believe, even when it's probably not conventionally, easy to do so. So I would love to know where that comes from, because I think authenticity is a critical ingredient for the best leaders, and it's also critical to your creative energy in terms of what you put out into the world. So it's much more important than just being aligned. It's also, informs the quality of the stuff you put out. So I'd love to know, where do you think that comes from?
Yeah. I mean, and if you want for your values to be a guiding principle, if you want for your values to be part of your strategy, if you want for your values to be a way to align resources in your team, then they have to be explicit. They have to be explicit, which means they have to be written down clearly and shared in all of the places where they need to be shared. We use our values very frequently at Planet Forward. We use them as part of our internal evaluation processes, the way that we give feedback to each other. We use them in our RFPs when we're looking for, a marketing vendor or a copy editor. We literally put our values. So your values have to be explicit. Your board has to understand them. Your employees have to understand them, because your values are not like the values of Planet Forward, of course, are aligned with my personal values, but they're not my personality, or my preferences, right? You have to really distinguish between those two things. The values belong to the organization, they're part of our code of conduct. Of course, they're informed heavily by what the founder thinks and believes, but they exist as as a as a being unto themselves, if that makes sense. And they also, our values help me to check myself to make sure that I'm making decisions that are aligned. They are a code, right? Um, and I think it's so important to articulate your values early on, at Planet Forward. Before we hired our first employee, or before we hired our second employee, we had our values written down. And I think trying to do that later on in an organization is more challenging. The earlier that you can articulate your values and share them and use them as a decision making principle, the better it's going to be for your ability to scale through those values.
I love that. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation today. So, before we wrap up, we do have a quick fire round of questions that we like to ask guests before we wrap up. So, one of them being, if you had 15 seconds to look back, Julia, what advice would you give to yourself back in 2010?
It's absolutely about taking care of yourself. Back in 2010, I did not have a spiritual practice, really. I definitely didn't have a physical practice. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't eating well. I wasn't really exercising. I was sleeping very poorly. And that caused so much stress and strain. And I really ran the risk of burning out. So the thing that I would say to myself in 2010 is absolutely before you show up for work, you have to show up for yourself. And it has to be a daily practice and something that you do because your organization is never going to be more well than you are as the founder. Your team is never going to be more joyful than you are joyful. They are never going to be more creative or tuned in or balanced than you are. And so it is your job, not just for yourself, but as the leader of your organization, to really, really radically invest in your own well being.
Yeah, that's so
I love
important. I love that. And what advice would you give to anyone that's really thinking about taking the leap themselves?
I would say just immerse yourself in the world of entrepreneurship and founders. Spend time, see if you can do a project in an early stage company. See if you have a certain skill set, just wiggle your way in there and offer to do some work. It could be pro bono, it could be low cost if you're trying to really get yourself in there. But, before you take the leap, dip your toe in and see if it's really for you and get as close to the founding team for as long as you can before you decide that you want to do it yourself.
Yeah.
I love that.
And final question. So, if you weren't a full food entrepreneur, what would you be doing?
Alternate universe. You don't nothing to do with food or tech or being an entrepreneur.
Really, really, really into weightlifting and working out these days. I
Okay.
think if I weren't doing what I'm doing, I'd probably try to become like a midlife CrossFit athlete
I love that.
with positions.
Love it.
I love that. Thank you so, so much, Julia. This was an incredible conversation. Thank you for taking the time. We enjoyed the discussion. And yeah, I look forward to hearing more about Planet Forward. Very excited about what you're building, and thank you for spending time with us.
Wonderful. Maria, Yvonne,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of the Startup Leap, TSL for short. Leave a review, tell us what you think of this episode on all our platforms at the Startup Leap Pod. Do you have a question? Ask us and we'll ask our guest. Go to thestartupleap.io. See you next time.